Canada just told the Pentagon to back off. A $27.7 billion defense contract that Washington considered locked down is now under review, and the United States is threatening consequences. Direct, explicit consequences. American officials warned that if Canada doesn't purchase the full fleet of 88 F-35 fighter jets from Lockheed Martin, the United States will fly more missions over Canadian airspace unilaterally. That's not a negotiating position. That's a threat to Canadian sovereignty dressed up as alliance management. Mark Carney ordered a comprehensive review of the F-35 contract. Sweden's Saab immediately offered an alternative. 72 Gripen-E fighters. 6 GlobalEye early warning aircraft built on Canadian Bombardier platforms. Full source code access. Domestic assembly lines in Ontario and Quebec. Technology transfer agreements. And 12,600 Canadian jobs, not promises. Jobs tied to manufacturing, maintenance, and industrial participation that Lockheed Martin never offered. Trump thought threatening Canada over trade would pressure Ottawa into compliance on defense procurement. Instead, Carney's government is using defense contracts as leverage to extract better terms from American suppliers or walk away entirely. Washington expected Canada to accept pressure and fall in line the way it always has. But 72% of Canadians now support switching to the Gripen over the F-35 according to a December 2025 ECOS poll. That's not a protest vote. That's a mandate. This isn't theory. This is happening right now. The Pentagon is openly discussing operational changes to NORAD if Canada proceeds with the Gripen. U.S. Ambassador Hoekstra warned that American jets would compensate for any Canadian shortfall. Industry Minister Mélanie Joly responded by stating, Canada expects industrial benefits exceeding the current $15.5 billion tied to F-35 participation. And those benefits must include genuine technology transfer and domestic control. Today, we're showing you how Trump's trade war threats triggered a complete reassessment of Canada's largest defense contract. How Sweden offered Canada something the United States refused, operational sovereignty. How Carney is leveraging American pressure to demand concessions Lockheed Martin never intended to give. And how Canada's choice between the F-35 and Gripen became a referendum on dependence versus autonomy that will define Canadian defense policy for decades. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Let's start with what Washington actually did. The United States didn't merely express concern about Canada reconsidering the F-35 purchase. Ambassador Hoekstra delivered explicit warnings in public statements. If Canada failed to purchase the full 88 F-35 aircraft, the United States would fly more missions over Canadian territory to compensate. American jets would patrol Canadian airspace more frequently. The US would expand its own fleet to cover the shortfall. These weren't diplomatic suggestions. These were operational threats designed to pressure Ottawa into compliance by questioning who would truly control Canadian airspace if the F-35 deal collapsed. Behind that pressure sat a massive existing commitment. Canada had already signed a $27.7 billion Canadian dollar agreement with Lockheed Martin for 88 F-35 aircraft. The first 16 jets were already scheduled for delivery at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona before eventual transfer to Canada. This wasn't a proposal under negotiation. This was a contract that Washington and Lockheed considered finalized, inevitable, and politically untouchable. For decades, that assumption would have been correct. Defense procurement followed alliance expectations. Pressure from Washington meant compliance from Ottawa. Carney's response wasn't to apologize or delay. It was to order a comprehensive review of the entire F-35 program and simultaneously open the door to Sweden's Saab. The review wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. Carney's government made it clear that Canada's largest defense contract in decades would now be evaluated not just on aircraft capability, but on industrial benefits, technology transfer, operational sovereignty, and whether the deal served Canadian interests or merely American alliance management. But Carney didn't stop there. Industry Minister Mélanie Joly stated publicly to Bloomberg that Canada expected industrial benefits exceeding the existing $15.5 billion Canadian dollars tied to F-35 participation. She emphasized that procurement decisions would be used to extract greater economic returns. This was a direct message to Lockheed Martin. The existing terms were no longer acceptable. Either renegotiate with significantly improved industrial participation and technology sharing, or Canada would seriously consider alternatives. That statement represented a fundamental break from past Canadian defense procurement, which traditionally prioritized alliance cohesion over economic leverage. Into that opening, Sweden's Saab delivered a proposal that rewrote the entire conversation. The package included 72 Gripen E fighters, 6 GlobalEye airborne early warning aircraft built on Canadian Bombardier platforms, domestic assembly lines in Ontario and Quebec, comprehensive technology transfer agreements, full source code access, and a projected 12,600 Canadian jobs tied directly to manufacturing and maintenance operations. The Saab offer wasn't just competitive on price, it was strategically designed to address Canada's core frustration: dependence on American approval for every aspect of operating and maintaining the F-35 fleet. The mathematical result is simple. Canada gets fewer total aircraft, 72 Gripen instead of 88 F-35, but gains operational control Lockheed Martin has never extended to any customer. Plus, domestic manufacturing infrastructure creating thousands of permanent jobs. Plus, technology transfer allowing Canada to modify, upgrade, and integrate weapons without waiting for Pentagon authorization. Plus, supply chain independence reducing vulnerability to American political pressure. Plus, industrial participation transforming Canada from a passive buyer into an active manufacturing partner in a global defense supply chain. The F-35 contract hurt Canadian leverage initially. 16 jets already scheduled for delivery, billions committed. Political momentum favoring completion. But survivors of that pressure, meaning Carney's government and Canadian aerospace companies, are now being protected and positioned to pivot toward a defense model that prioritizes sovereignty and industrial participation over maximum alliance integration permanently. Here's where it gets fascinating. The F-35 operates under a system where Lockheed Martin maintains complete control over the aircraft's digital core. Every software update requires Pentagon approval. Every weapons integration flows through American authorization channels. Every mission system modification must be cleared by US defense officials. That structure means Canada, even after spending $27.7 billion, would never fully control the aircraft it purchased. Those jets would remain dependent on American approval for routine operations, upgrades, and adaptations, which forces Canada into a position where even basic operational decisions during a crisis could be delayed or denied based on Washington's political calculations at that moment. So Canadian sovereignty over its own defense capabilities becomes conditional on maintaining perfect political alignment with United States foreign policy priorities forever. Here's what Washington doesn't understand. The control issue matters more than the capability gap. The F-35 is undeniably a superior combat platform in high-intensity conflicts against near-peer adversaries like Russia or China. Former Canadian military leaders, including Lieutenant General Yvon Blonde and former Chief of Defense Staff Tom Lawson, have stated this explicitly. In a direct confrontation with advanced air defense systems, the F-35's stealth and sensor fusion would deliver near-total effectiveness, while the Gripen would struggle significantly. That assessment is accurate, but it rests on a critical assumption that Canada would be fighting that kind of war independently, making its own strategic decisions about when and how to deploy its air force. The reality is different. In any conflict requiring F-35 capabilities against Russia or China, Canada would be operating under US command as part of NORAD and NATO structures. American strategic decisions would determine mission parameters, targeting priorities, and rules of engagement. Canada's operational independence in such scenarios is already limited by alliance structures, which raises the fundamental question the Pentagon doesn't want addressed. If Canada won't have independent control during high-intensity conflicts anyway, why accept permanent dependence on American approval for every aspect of aircraft maintenance, upgrades, and operations during peacetime when genuine sovereignty actually matters? This creates a fascinating dynamic. Canadian defense costs rise in the short term if Canada switches to the Gripen, operating 2 different fighter fleets, 16 F-35s already delivered, plus 72 Gripens creates logistical complexity. Separate training pipelines, separate spare parts inventories, separate maintenance infrastructure, separate weapons integration programs. Military planners accurately warn that split fleet operations increase costs and reduce overall readiness compared to a unified F-35 fleet. But Canadian decision makers are accepting those higher short-term costs because the alternative is permanent structural dependence on American systems that Washington just demonstrated it will weaponize during political disputes. Better to pay more for operational sovereignty than lock Canada into a defense model where every decision requires external permission indefinitely. Meanwhile, United States defense planners face a different calculation entirely. Lockheed Martin loses a $27.7 billion contract if Canada switches to Gripen. But the larger concern isn't the immediate sale, it's the precedent. If Canada, one of America's closest allies and a core NATO member, successfully pushes back against F-35 pressure while remaining within alliance structures, smaller NATO countries will notice. Denmark already operates F-35s and has voiced open frustration over aircraft availability and maintenance downtime. Poland, Finland, and other nations watching this confrontation will ask themselves whether maximum combat capability justifies permanent dependence on American authorization for basic operations. The strategic mistake Washington made was treating this as a simple procurement dispute, rather than recognizing it as a sovereignty question that could reshape how allies evaluate defense partnerships permanently. The Gripen operates differently. Saab offered Canada full source code access, the same arrangement Brazil negotiated. That means Canadian technicians can modify systems, integrate weapons, and plan upgrades without waiting for Swedish government approval. The Gripen still uses an American-made engine requiring US export licenses, so total independence remains impossible. But the level of operational sovereignty is dramatically higher than the F-35 model. Canadian Air Force commanders could adapt mission software, integrate domestically developed weapons, and respond to emerging threats without external authorization delays. That control matters during crises when speed and adaptability determine outcomes. Analysts tracking Canadian aerospace policy confirmed this. The debate shifted from which aircraft is better to which partnership structure serves Canadian sovereignty. Once that frame took hold, public opinion moved decisively. The December 2025 ECOS poll, showing 72% support for Gripen, wasn't about aircraft specifications. It reflected Canadians recognizing that dependence on American approval systems makes sovereignty theoretical rather than real, and that Trump's threats over trade and territory made that dependence unacceptable going forward. While Canadian domestic debate intensifies, Sweden is executing an industrial strategy that doesn't include American veto power. Saab's offer to build GlobalEye aircraft on Bombardier platforms directly addresses Canada's aerospace industry concerns. Bombardier has faced uncertainty about its long-term role in defense production as civilian aircraft orders fluctuate and government support remains inconsistent. The Gripen deal would embed Bombardier into a global military supply chain with guaranteed long-term demand. Assembly lines in Ontario and Quebec wouldn't just build aircraft for Canada. They would manufacture components and subsystems for Gripen exports to Brazil and potentially future customers. Canada would transition from a passive buyer accepting terms dictated by Lockheed Martin to an active manufacturing partner, sharing in production revenues for decades. That industrial shift matters beyond job creation numbers. The 12,600 projected Canadian jobs aren't temporary construction positions. They're permanent manufacturing, engineering, and maintenance roles tied to sustaining domestic aircraft production and supporting ongoing operations. Defense economists noted that successful implementation could position Canada as the North American manufacturing hub for Gripen exports if additional countries in the Western Hemisphere choose the platform. Mexico, Colombia, and other nations evaluating fighter modernization programs would have access to Canadian-manufactured Gripens with favorable financing through existing trade relationships. That multiplies the economic impact beyond Canada's own fleet requirements. The human cost of maintaining F-35 dependence falls entirely on Canadian sovereignty and future flexibility. Canada faces no immediate security crisis, requiring maximum combat capability against near-peer adversaries. The realistic threat environment includes Russian strategic bomber patrols near Canadian Arctic airspace, which both F-35 and Gripen can intercept effectively. And sovereignty missions over vast northern territories, where operational readiness and maintenance turnaround time matter more than stealth characteristics. The U.S. Government Accountability Office reported that F-35 mission readiness struggles to consistently exceed 50%. while independent estimates place Gripen readiness between 80% and 90%. For the missions Canada actually flies, daily sovereignty patrols, and quick reaction alert scrambles, higher readiness matters more than absolute combat advantage in contested environments. Canada won't enter with a full US support anyway. Cost cascading reveals the long-term burden. Each F-35 flight hour costs between $35,000 and $47,000. The Gripen operates at approximately $8,000 per hour, over a 30-year aircraft lifespan, assuming 200 flight hours annually per aircraft. An 88-aircraft F-35 fleet would cost Canada $18.5 billion to $24.8 billion in operating costs alone, excluding the $27.7 billion purchase price and infrastructure investments. A 72-aircraft Gripen fleet flying the same hours would cost approximately $3.5 billion over the same period. The difference, $15 billion to $21 billion, represents money that could fund naval modernization, Arctic infrastructure, cyber defense capabilities, or literally any other national security priority, instead of subsidizing Lockheed Martin's maintenance monopoly. The qualification failure happens at the political level. Canada qualifies as a sovereign nation capable of defending its territory and contributing to alliance operations. But under the F-35 model, that sovereignty becomes conditional on maintaining perfect alignment with Washington's foreign policy. Every software update requires US approval. Every weapons integration needs Pentagon authorization. Every mission system adaptation waits for Lockheed Martin clearance. That structure works during decades when US-Canada relations remained stable and American pressures stayed subtle. But Trump openly discussed annexing Canada as the 51st state. Trade threats multiplied. Tariffs became weapons. The relationship that made F-35 dependence tolerable no longer exists. Behavioral changes follow. Canadian defense planners must now assume American political pressure will be applied ruthlessly whenever Ottawa's interests diverge from Washington's preferences. While American pressure increases, Canadian aerospace firms that survived decades of underinvestment and neglect are now positioned better than they've been since the Avro Aero cancellation in 1959. Bombardier secures guaranteed long-term defense contracts. Quebec and Ontario gain permanent aerospace manufacturing infrastructure. Canadian engineers develop expertise in advanced fighter systems and early warning platforms. Thousands of high-skilled technical jobs anchor economic development in regions that desperately need industrial investment. And Canada builds a defense industrial base capable of sustaining operations without depending entirely on suppliers who answer to foreign governments that just threaten Canadian sovereignty explicitly. The endgame is clear. Canada either locks itself into permanent dependence on American authorization for every aspect of defending its own territory, or it accepts short-term complexity and higher initial costs to build long-term operational sovereignty. There's no middle ground that gives Canada both maximum F-35 combat capability and genuine control over how those capabilities get used, maintained, and adapted. Washington designed the F-35 program specifically to prevent that outcome. Every customer accepts the same deal: access to advanced technology in exchange for permanent American oversight of operations, maintenance, and upgrades. The fighter jet shortage doesn't get fixed under the F-35 model. It gets worse. Canada needs aircraft that actually fly missions, not aircraft that spend 50% of their operational life grounded, waiting for parts, software updates, or authorization from Lockheed Martin to perform basic maintenance. The US Government Accountability Office documented these readiness problems repeatedly. Denmark complained publicly. Other operators experienced the same challenges, but remained quiet to avoid American political retaliation. Canada choosing the Gripen wouldn't just solve its own readiness problems, it would give other allies permission to admit that F-35 operational performance doesn't match the promises Lockheed Martin made during procurement negotiations. The social cascade from maintaining F-35 dependence extends beyond defense policy. It teaches Canadians that sovereignty is performative rather than real. That alliance membership requires accepting subordinate status permanently. That pressing national interests matter less than avoiding American displeasure. That when Washington threatens consequences, Ottawa retreats regardless of public opinion, economic logic, or strategic necessity. Those lessons reshape national identity. They influence how future governments approach trade disputes, resource development, Arctic sovereignty, and every other area where Canadian and American interests diverge. The message becomes clear. Canada can have opinions, but Washington makes decisions. Canada, meanwhile, builds a defense model that serves domestic needs first, contributes to collective defense second, and views American demands for compliance as negotiating positions rather than commands. Mark Carney's government isn't rejecting alliance membership. It's redefining what membership means. Allies cooperate. They don't subordinate. Partners negotiate. They don't obey. The $27.7 billion at stake in the F-35 contract isn't just buying aircraft. It's defining whether Canada operates as a sovereign nation that chooses its defense partnerships strategically or as a client state that accepts American terms because refusing carries unacceptable political costs. And that restructuring is permanent. Buy Canada policies for defense procurement don't expire when political pressure fades. Domestic assembly lines don't shut down after one election cycle. Technology transfer agreements and the source code access don't get revoked because Washington issues new threats. Industrial partnerships with Sweden, Brazil, and other Gripen operators create relationships that last decades and expand beyond fighter jets into broader aerospace cooperation. The supply chain infrastructure Canada builds to support Gripen operations serves Canadian sovereignty permanently, regardless of who occupies the White House or what trade disputes emerge next year. Even if Trump disappeared tomorrow and US-Canada relations improved dramatically, the structural problems with F-35 dependence remain. Lockheed Martin still controls all software. The Pentagon still approves every weapons integration. American export restrictions still determine what modifications Canada can make. Those constraints are built into the F-35 program by design. They're not negotiable because they are fundamental to how the United States maintains technological dominance and ensures allied dependence. Canada choosing the Gripen acknowledges that reality and chooses a different path rather than pretending dependence doesn't matter. Pentagon officials thought threatening NORAD restructuring would pressure Canada into compliance. They made Canadian sovereignty the issue instead of alliance burden sharing. They elevated a procurement decision into a question of national independence. They forced Canadians to choose between accepting American control over defense capabilities or building alternatives that reduce dependence. And 72% of Canadians chose independence. Washington can't threaten that away. They can only make the cost of sovereignty higher. But Carney's government already demonstrated it's willing to pay those costs. The review continues. The Saab offer remains on the table. Lockheed Martin either renegotiates terms that address Canadian sovereignty concerns or watches the largest F-35 export contract in Canada disappear. Trump thought he was leveraging defense procurement to maintain American control over Canadian policy. He permanently restructured how Canada evaluates defense partnerships. He made operational sovereignty a priority that can't be ignored. He forced Canadian aerospace companies, labor unions, and the general public to recognize that dependence on American systems carries strategic costs that Trump's own behavior made impossible to accept. Canada paid short-term political costs, diplomatic tensions, threats, public confrontation with its largest ally and trading partner. But Canada is emerging with a defense industrial base that serves Canadian interests, reduces vulnerability to American pressure, and positions the country to operate as a genuinely sovereign nation, rather than a subordinate partner expected to comply automatically. The United States paid no short-term cost, but long-term cost is alliance credibility eroded permanently. Other countries watching this confrontation learned that American pressure doesn't guarantee compliance anymore. That alternatives exist. That sovereignty matters more than maximum combat capability when the combat scenarios requiring that capability would place you under American command anyway. Canada wins. Washington loses. And the F-35 program just revealed its greatest vulnerability isn't Russian air defense systems. It's offering allied nations a choice between American technology and sovereign control, then threatening them when they choose sovereignty.